This is Robert Clotworthy, and you are listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Here are your hosts, James McQuiston, Oak Island theorist and author, along with John Hamels, PhD and historical researcher. Get the whole story right here, brought to you by Rabbit Hole Investigations.
Hi everybody, I'm Doc Hamels and welcome to a very special edition of Oak Island Plus, episode 12. And with me as always is
Jim McQuiston, and we got such a great show this time. Before we get to it though, I think we have some stats that are worth mentioning.
Oh yeah, for those of you that have been following us for a year, this marks our full year anniversary. We have just about 25,000 views altogether, and Jim, we're almost up to 800 subscribers. So please, if you're watching and you haven't subscribed, please help us by hitting that subscribe button. That helps us with our presence on the internet and with YouTube. So Jim, we're going to be doing a special show today, and I want to do some opening comments from my perspective. Folks, as you all know, we're historians and researchers. We don't dig gold. And what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about some new material. And there's going to be terms in names that are not typical Anglo or English. And I'm going to do my very, very best to respect these names, these towns and cities and areas as we talk about our show today. And with all due respect, Canada is not my home country, but I do have family in Canada, so I respect your culture because there's multiple levels of the cultures there in Nova Scotia, in Quebec, and so forth. And so we are going to do our very best to be respectful as we go through the history today that we're going to present. This is going to be in depth. Jim?
And of course there's Mi'kmaq, and there's French, and there's British involved in our story. And viewers of Oak Island, the Curse of Oak Island, they're used to getting a little bit of information each show, and it's been going on for 11 years. Ours, we're not connected to their show.
Not at all.
We're Oak Island Plus, but we approach it differently. We try to take one subject and kind of beat the heck out of it, you know, and get experts, get extra help from anybody that we can. And what happened with this episode, it all started with a seed from our buddy Art Guinness from up in Nova Scotia. He found a wall that looked like it was built like an M, and it overlooked a port called Port Medway. Well, that's all we knew at the time, but then I thought, well, what's the significance of Port Medway? And I found out it was originally Port Maltois, or Port Malta, or Port of the Maltese.
Right.
And at the time I thought, well, that's odd. What does Malta have to do with Nova Scotia? Well,
And I was kidding you, maybe it's a W.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think so.
We found out. And as we started delving into this, Art sent us some more information. Doc contacted one museum in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. I contacted another one in Quebec. Now, Quebec seems a long ways away, but the original Nova Scotia went right up to Quebec. It was like a short sail over to Quebec. And they helped a lot. And then Art got us in contact with the Knights of Malta of Nova Scotia. Now that's a knighthood that you haven't heard about before. You always hear about the Knights Templar. There is absolutely no evidence of Knights Templar ever being in North America. There's a lot of conjecture, but there's no solid verifiable evidence. But what we found is that there's a ton of evidence about the Knights of Malta. And you'll find out who they were. They've way outlasted the Knights Templar.
Right.
And we've been talking about the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, and today there's about 150 of them still around. But what we didn't know all this time was that they were in direct conflict with each other. And so that's the story that we're going to tell today.
And Jim, I just want to add one thing. As folks watch The Curse of Oak Island, you're bouncing around in different time frames.
Yes.
We have stayed pretty close to our own band. And what would you say those years are, Jim?
Well, it revolves around 1632, which is my theory, but The early 1600s, essentially, and one of the reasons is that there's a lot of historical data and a lot of artifacts
Right.
that match that time period. So to me, it seems like the likeliest period when something would have happened. And in fact, you're going to learn that we nailed down 2 specific Frenchmen who were in Mahone Bay in the early 1630s by name, and they were canoeing around islands and talking about islands, and it's all been documented. The other thing that Doc realized is that we're going to tell you why the building on Lot 5 was likely torn down and filled in, and you'll find that out as we talk.
Okay.
So we probably better get going. So the other thing that we should mention is that we're going to, because there's so much data, we're going to be reading quite a bit of the story as the slides appear on your screen.
Lots of information today.
Yeah, lots of information and 2 parts.
Right. So, if you want to take a little breather, you watch part 1, and then you can go get something to eat, and then click on part 2, because they're going to be right together on YouTube. So, Jim, why don't you just get us started with the story?
Well, this very first slide here begins the story. On September 18th, 1632, a man named Andrew Forrester, who was actually 3rd in charge of the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia settlers, along with 25 other Scots, made a daring raid on a French fort that was located over at St. John River, New Brunswick. That was part of Nova Scotia at the time, and it belonged to Charles de La Tour, who we've talked about in the past. Well, after talking their way into the fort, they ransacked the place and forced the commander to tell them where the furs and the merchandise and food and all that was hidden. And so they restocked themselves, and they took off in their 2 vessels to go across the Bay of Fundy back to Port Royal, Nova Scotia. So this slide that you're looking on, this is the current archaeological dig at Fort La Tour. And in the lower right-hand corner, you'll notice 2 lead crosses. Well, the cross on the left was found at this site, and it's shown here next to a similar cross that was found on Oak Island. The La Tour cross, that's what I'm going to call it, has been tentatively dated to about 1631, based on the year the fort was built. While not identical, they are essentially the same size and design, including the hole at the top. Well, Charles de La Tour and his father Claude actually became the owners of Oak Island just the year before through a 1630 deed that was written for them that included, quote, all the lands and seas 14 leagues above La Have. Well, 14 leagues is about 52 miles. And that would mean that it included all of Mahone Bay, and Oak Island is in Mahone Bay. Now, William Alexander, who we've mentioned on just about every show, he was the proprietor of Nova Scotia, and he wrote this deed in French to these gentlemen, and he called this area Merlegash. And this is the first time it's known that this word was ever recorded. But it turns up in French just a few years later with these 2 gentlemen that are in that same bay talking about islands. And while it's often assigned to Lunenburg Bay, there's a great amount of evidence that shows that it, in fact, included Mahone Bay, where Oak Island is located. So, a little background, in 1629, both Claude La Tour and his son Charles were made Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia by William Alexander. And this was an attempt to strengthen the bond between the Scots and the French. And Merlegash happens to be an old Gaelic word. It's actually 2 words, Mir, meaning a part of, and Lagash, an alliance. So Merlegash means a part of an alliance in Gaelic. And it appears on this next slide. This is from 1684, and it's a French map, and it leaves no doubt that Mahone Bay was called Merlegash. It has Merlegash written on the map 3 times. Now, I got this map from Dalhousie University about an hour from Oak Island. They're a very respected university, and they say in their description of the map that Mahone Bay is called Mirligash in this map, on this map. And to the right, you can see that I twisted the map just slightly to fit a modern day map of Mahone Bay. This in no way matches Lunenburg, which actually leans the opposite direction. But so the owners of Oak Island, or Mahone Bay at least, would have been Sir William Alexander because of his grant of Nova Scotia. Then he granted it to Claude and Charles de la Tour, Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. Charles sold it to Sir Thomas Temple, who was the last Knight Baronet in Nova Scotia to ever receive land, and he happened to be a forefather of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So this whole story is just going totally full circle. So on the next slide, we have a drawing that was actually done by the famous Samuel de Champlain of the French fort at Port Royal. And this fort was torn down by the British and replaced nearby with a similar fort called Charles Fort. Now the fact that it was torn down is going to play into the story about
Right.
Lot 5. Mm-hmm. So in December of 1632, Isaac de Razilli, who was a Knight of Malta and the new leader of Nova Scotia, appeared at Port Royal and presented orders from the crowns of both England and France to take possession. And Andrew Forster complied, and soon after, he and 41 Scottish pioneers who chose to return home were given passage in a French vessel called the St. John. They landed in England early in February of 1633. And Razilli also visited Mirligash, or Mahone Bay, as reported by his lieutenant, Nicholas Dennis, who accompanied him. Now, these are real men. They're recorded in history, and Dennis wrote an extremely long story about his sailing up and down the coast of Nova Scotia, including going into Mahone Bay.
And Jim, this action was a result of King Charles wanting to marry, and part of the deal was he gave this Nova Scotia back to the French, yes?
Yes, he married the sister of the French king, and he only received half of his dowry, and he was hurting for money, so he said, I'll give you Nova Scotia back if you give me the other half of the dowry. So that kind of pulled the rug out from underneath William Alexander and the 100 or so Knights Baronet that had signed up for land there, and it was contested for centuries. Even into the 1800s, they were having meetings and saying, this land is ours, you took it away from us. But they never did get their land back, and part of the reason that they were ousted was the Knights of Malta. There was an actual contest going on, in more ways than one, between the Knights of Malta and the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. So I always have fun with this name, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu. He was the right-hand man of the King of France, and he's very famous in French history, and I think he even appeared in some of the Three Musketeers.
Yes,
type of
yeah,
books.
I've seen that.
Well, he was spearheading this whole French adventure, and they called it Acadia. The Scots called it Nova Scotia or New Scotland, but the French called it Acadia. So he divided the land there between Charles de la Tour, Nicholas Dennis, and Isaac de Razilli. Mm-hmm. But he put Razilli in charge. He was overall in charge. And he was supposed to be in charge of all of New France, which would include Quebec, but he demurred to Champlain because he said Champlain is just too knowledgeable and basically too famous of a guy. I'm not going to come in here and take his job. So Champlain stayed in charge of Quebec, and Razilli stayed in charge of Nova Scotia. Well, this Andrew Forster wasn't just anybody. He'd been Undersecretary of State for both King James and King Charles of Great Britain, with William Alexander being the Secretary of State. So they knew each other very well, and that's why Alexander chose him as third in charge there. So his departure, Forster's departure with his 41 other men, marked the practical end of the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia settlement. However, land grants continued to be made until 1638, and claims on the land by the Knights Baronet continued to be made over the next 2 centuries. So, although he wasn't a Knight Baronet himself, Andrew's father, Sir George Forster, was. George became a Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia in 1625, the very first year of the knighthood.
On November 24, 1632, Cardinal Richelieu, right-hand man to the King of France, who himself descended from a long line of Knights of Malta and often wore their Maltese cross, wrote to King Louis XIII, and it says, "The King's 3 vessels that left Brittany last summer, under the command of Commander de Razilli, arrived at Le Havre on September 8th, on which we were no sooner established that, following the King's orders and the commissions of the King of Great Britain, which commanded the Scots to leave Port Royal, we were asked to return them on board one of our ships. We held talks with them and sent them a vessel on which they will return, and our people will transport them and remain in their place at the said Port Royal."
And this is an example of a primary source document. This is a letter that Richelieu actually wrote. And we have some other primary source documents.
One source gives the names of the Scots families who stayed behind as the Paisleys, the Collisons, the Melansons, Peters, and Kessies. A Melanson was eventually put in charge of Port Royal. This encounter in the earliest days of Nova Scotia was a direct confrontation between the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia that we've talked about in the last 11 episodes and the Knights of Malta, Jim. In this month's episode, we're going to show that this rivalry was much bigger than is typically recorded by mainstream historians or possibly by any other historian besides us.
Yep.
On this next slide, you can see the medallion worn by the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. Next to it is a stone carving from Malta showing the typical modern version of the Maltese cross. First, some background on the Knights of Malta. Even before the idea of the Knights Templar came about, another knightly order had already appeared in the Holy Land known as the Knights Hospitaller. Their mission was to provide healthcare and, if possible, hospitals for pilgrims and crusading knights. While their true origins were even earlier, they were fully organized in 1099, that's pretty early, and officially recognized by the Pope in 1113. The Knights Templar were officially recognized a full 6 years later in 1119. This slide, next, shows the transition of the Maltese cross from a simple true cross to an 8-pointed Maltese cross.
And just to talk about that slide for a minute, originally up in the top left corner you can see what's often called a true cross. It's a simple Christian cross, and that was their original coat of arms. Then they started using what's called the cross moline, and this example just to the right of that is from 1216, and it starts having the 8 points on it, which are the 8 points are the Beatitudes of the Catholic Church, but they also may stand for the 8 divisions. They called them langues after languages.
Right, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later.
And then below in the left is the first cross that looks similar to a modern Maltese cross, and that was from 1234, and that was the first seal used by the Hospitallers. Then at the right is the second seal, and that gets even a little bit closer to looking like a modern Maltese cross. And then on the far right is the big Maltese cross, and the first time that they can find this on anything, on a coin or a document or a shield or anything, is from 1567. So you can see it took like 500 years or 400 years or whatever to develop, but that's now the famous Maltese cross.
So it morphed over time. Okay, on the next slide, we see that the headquarters of the Grand Master on Malta, there's a wall mural painted sometime before 1622 by the artist Leonello Spada. This shows the Knights of Malta heading into battle carrying or wearing both the true cross that you mentioned and the Maltese cross, highlighting how the various crosses, the true cross, the Maltese cross, and the cross moline, were often interchangeable.
So the Order of the Hospitallers have also been known as the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, and they later would take on the names of the Knights of Rhodes when they moved there, and then finally the Knights of Malta. So while the Templars were dissolved officially in 1312, the Knights of Malta continue in their original form, far outlasting the Templars even until today. And naturally, they would have left much more history behind and more artifacts and paintings, things like that, than the Knights Templar. And this is certainly true for Nova Scotia. So the last known original group of Malta Knights in Great Britain was dissolved in Scotland, and that's part of our story. That took place in 1563. However, they carried on in other Catholic countries, particularly in France, where they joined in with the French Navy. And as the Templars were disbanded, most of their possessions and properties were given to the Knights of Malta. And this following slide shows the documents from 1312 in which, on the left, the final vestiges of Templarism were banned in perpetual prohibition by the Pope. And at right, you can see where the Templar possessions were transferred to the Knights of Malta. Now, not all of them were transferred, and some that were transferred were contested. So it wasn't just a flip of a switch situation, but generally speaking, the possessions of the Knights Templar ended up in the hands of the Knights of Malta, which would mean that those possessions could include crazy things like the menorah or the Ark of the Covenant or something like that, you know, but a lot of it was land, particularly land. So today the order still exists. It's a Catholic organization, and it's still dedicated to healthcare and to building hospitals. And as I said, there are thousands of members who serve at various levels of service. But no longer is there a military aspect to it. It's strictly taking care of people. So before 1602, several voyages to the upper North America coast had been made by both the French and the English in an attempt to study the feasibility of settlements and to explore the beaver fur trade, which turned out to be the driving economic force for the next century or more. Now, they had established Virginia, and they had a few problems there, but we're talking about from particularly Cape Cod up through Nova Scotia, and which actually was the heart of all the beaver pelt business up in there. And so it was reported back in the day that the average number of beaver pelts sent back just by the French was 15,000 per year.
What?
Yeah.
15,000?
And one year, the record was 22,000 beaver pelts sent back by French trappers.
We're talking serious trade.
Yes.
Wow.
And on top of that, the Scots were doing the same thing.
Oh my gosh.
They were trading beads and different items to the Mi'kmaq and other tribes, including probably the Iroquois. But they had some interaction with them. And so it was a major, major industry, and these two knighthoods were vying for that industry. So I got to see the Stone Road up close in 2021, and I also saw the dig they were doing for the where they found the Mi'kmaq artifacts.
Now you're talking about on Oak Island.
On Oak Island.
Okay.
And because of the fact that they found European artifacts and Mi'kmaq artifacts in the same area, within like a stone's throw of each other, near the road, I got the idea in my head that maybe that was a trading post or a trading grounds there where oxen from British or French ships could bring goods like cloth, things like that, up on the island, and the Mi'kmaq, who reportedly came down Gold River from the New Ross area where all the big lakes were, bring the beaver pelts down, pull their canoes up on that road, and they would trade right there. And so the artifacts prove that, and one of the artifacts is a bag seal that used to bind cloth when it left the British Isles. They had to put one of those bag seals on it. That was found there. There was a measuring weight. I don't know if you remember when Rick Lagina found that. And so there's enough items to show that that's at least an acceptable scenario, that spot in the swamp was a place where either the French or the Scots met with the Mi'kmaq, trade items to them for beaver pelts to keep this business going.
In fact, in a recent episode of Curse of Oak Island, Jim, that has aired already, before one of our filmings of our April show, Carm Legg, remember, identified an artifact as French from as far back as the early 1600s. Kind of fits, exactly fitting our narrative. Other trading items, including a measuring weight that you mentioned, and perhaps a trading tassel or dangle. Many other artifacts on Oak Island have dated to the 1600 time frame. We've seen Oak Island, they had those ox shoes and all kinds of things, and they also mentioned recently that looked like there's a wharf. So it fits exactly what you were just talking about. So let me keep going. It was in 1602 that North American settlement took a more serious turn. After some short ventures into the southern latitudes, France and England had resolved to leave South America to the Spanish and the Portuguese to fight over, but didn't hesitate to attack their treasure ships when possible. Queen Elizabeth I of England sent Bartholomew Gosnold, an apparent nephew and certainly a relative of Sir Francis Bacon, on an exploratory voyage to the area that later became New England. Gosnold, shown here in a modern-day reproduction, named both Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard in that same year. He also attempted a short-lived colony on another nearby island, and he brought back considerable knowledge of New England.
And you'll notice on that slide, his mother was Dorothy Bacon, and Sir Francis Bacon had a sister, Dorothy Bacon, and Gosnold's mother lived in the same town where Francis Bacon's father lived, so the odds are in favor of her being his aunt. And when he went over, he had a friend of his from college that went with him, and they were the first two Englishmen to set foot in New England, on the shorelines of New England.
You know, Jim, as we go through our episodes, we keep seeing all these interconnections of these families, both with in the French and in the Scottish and the British. I mean, they're all connected somehow, isn't it?
Yeah, it's our multi-generational conspiracy of elites that we've been talking about for quite a while.
Okay, so anyways, Queen Elizabeth felt that the land belonged to England since it was claimed during the 1497 voyage of John Cabot, the first voyage to the mainland of North America. On that trip was a gentleman named William Weston. A short time later, Weston made another voyage to the shores of North America in 1499 and became the first Englishman to lead a fleet to America. Now, Cabot, while sailing for the English, was actually Venetian.
And on this slide here, at the bottom right, you'll see a blue image, and this is a note where Weston sailed with John Cabot, and he is given support from the king, and he actually gives Weston a reward on January 1498. as shown in this document. And the arrow actually points to W. Weston. That's William Weston. And at the top left is a letter from Henry VII. It's titled By the King, and it mentions Newfoundland. And it provides for the suspension of some type of legal action against Weston because the king said, quote, he will, quote, shortly, with God's grace, pass and sail for to search and find, if he can, the Newfoundland. So this is all recent discoveries over the past 5 years or so, but these are, again, primary source documents that historians in England have been discovering and studying that show that this William Weston was the first Englishman to lead a fleet to Nova Scotia. Well, an earlier William Weston was the very last original Grand Master of the Knights of Malta in England. And this William Weston's family had already been intimately connected with the Order of the Knights of St. John. His uncle, Sir John Weston, had served as the Lord Prior in England, and 2 more of his uncles had held the post of Commander of the Light Cavalry of Malta. And that was an office generally conferred on the most illustrious knights of the English language, or lang, or tongue, that's what they call them, and it was essentially the English branch of the Knights of Malta. And this probably is where the younger William Weston learned his trade, but this elder William Weston actually defended Rhodes against the Turks in 1480. So he was placed in command of a ship in the Navy of the Order of St. John. Now they turned it, because they lived on islands, they really expanded into navies, and that's how they joined up with France, principally by joining in with the French Navy. But he is known to have sailed the Santa Ana, captained it, and this was described, oddly enough, as, quote, the first ironclad recorded in history, sheathed with metal and perfectly cannon-proof, with room for 500 men and provisions for 6 months. That's how big these ships were. So when, for instance, William Alexander sent 2 men-of-war ships over to Nova Scotia in 1630, he probably sent about 1,000 people there. Right then. So people think of it as only a few dozen people in Nova Scotia. There were thousands there. So again, this may have been where the younger William Weston learned his skills. So the Malta Order was dissolved in England in 1540, and Sir William Weston, Knight of Malta, last Grand Master there, died on May 7th, 1540, the very day on which the order was dissolved. Now, he reportedly collapsed on hearing the news, but had been suffering from failing health for at least a year. And you'll see on this slide, the ship on the left-hand side is the Santa Ana, at least a drawing of the Santa Ana. And the tomb on the right is an effigy of Weston's burial site, and you can see a skeletal effigy at the bottom of this thing. So again, these are historic figures that are recorded in many ways in France and in England.
So these guys were the forerunners of the explorers that eventually ends up in Nova Scotia.
Yes.
Okay.
So the Knights of Malta would last a few more years in Scotland until it was dissolved there in 1563 by Mary, Queen of Scots, who we've mentioned in the past, under pressure from a Protestant parliament. And 4 men involved in this final transaction of the Knights of Malta and the Temple, as they called it, which would be the Templars, in Scotland, had heirs who became Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. And one of those men, interestingly enough, was Walter Sandilands, who married William Alexander's granddaughter.
Here we go again.
And he held land on Anticosti Island, which included, when they said Anticosti, they were talking about Anticosti Island and part of the Quebec shoreline. And we found out that Alexander received that in a separate grant, a grant separate from his original Nova Scotia grant.
So for those that aren't familiar with Anticosti Island, it's just in the same area as Nova Scotia, but north of it in the bay.
Basically in the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
Mm-hmm.
And Walter was the heir of the very last Grand Master of the Knights of Malta and the Temple in Scotland from just a generation earlier, and he was married to the daughter of the world's first known Freemason, William Alexander Jr.
Wow.
So this just ties the story together like nobody's ever done before. So throughout the 1500s, several trips to America were made by both English and French, most notably Jacques Cartier and Sir Walter Raleigh. And in this photo, you'll see Cartier on the left, and you'll see Sir Walter Raleigh on the right. So other than Jamestown, which was having its own struggles, it really wasn't until 1602 that more formal efforts were made by both England and France to settle the northern part of North America and to claim that land. And Gosnold was expected to create a permanent colony, which he tried to do. But the odds were against him, as the perils of the New World, which included scurvy, bad weather,
I can't even imagine.
conflicts with the local people, and general starvation, wiped out a lot of communities, not just Roanoke, but other ones as well.
Meanwhile, in France, the powerful Cardinal Richelieu, right-hand man, as we mentioned, to the king, granted the rights to all fur trading in this upper region of North America to a gentleman named Aymar de Chase, a commander of the Knights of Malta of the Order of St. Lazarus, shown in the next slide. Chase was also the ambassador to England. After agreeing to command an expedition to the St. Lawrence River, Chase was appointed the Viceroy of Canada by King Henry IV on February 6, 1602.
Right around the same time Gosnold was going there
Kind of interesting,
for
huh?
Queen Elizabeth. That's when the rivalry began.
This is crazy. So Chase put together a team principally of 3 men. Samuel de Champlain, a nephew of Dupont, one of the other adventurers, plus Pierre Dubois, Sieur de Mont, whose forefather was Knights of Malta Grand Master Pierre de Mont from 1568 to 1572, and Francois Gravé Dupont, whose forefather was Pierre Dupont, Grand Master of Malta from 1534 to 1535. Can we be any more connected to the Knights of Malta?
The Knights of Malta surrounded this whole adventure into Nova Scotia by the French.
I have studied some of the other books on Oak Island and so forth, and there's not a word of these guys, so I don't know why they missed these guys. All right, so while neither Champlain nor the de Monts, the overall leaders of the French adventure, were known to the Knights of Malta, they were financed and influenced by members of this group. And Champlain was likely connected to Pierre Dupont, Grand Master of Malta, through his uncle Francois Gravé Dupont. In 1604, Henry IV of France gave to Pierre Sieur de Mont all of America, from the 40th to the 46th degree of north latitude, including the future sites of Philadelphia on one hand and Montreal on the other. Wow. He gave de Mont permission to create a colony in the name of France, and this is when the French first reached Nova Scotia, 1604. It is said that de Mont first landed at La Have, located not far from Mahone Bay and Oak Island, and in fact, Samuel de Champlain wrote that they visited a large bay full of islands to the east, which would have been Mahone Bay. They named the islands the Martyrs because some Frenchmen had been killed there. Now, according to Oak Island theorist Stephen Sora, there is some indication that Champlain remained in Mahone Bay for 3 days, Jim. However, the group eventually moved to the opposite side of Nova Scotia, the leeward side, where they established Port Royal by at least 1605. There may be a marker on Oak Island commemorating the uncle of Samuel de Champlain, who was captain of Provence, located in southeastern France, which I know we're going to speak about a little later. In 1613, the French colony of Port Royal was attacked by an Englishman, or perhaps a Scotsman, named Samuel Argall. After that, the remaining French blended in with the native Mi'kmaq, and from this mix, at least in part, came the Acadians.
And what's interesting about Provence being in southern or southeastern France is that they've traced some of the artifacts on Oak Island to southeastern France.
Curious, huh?
Curious. Huh? Well, so in 1621, James I of Great Britain made over part of this new domain to his subject, Sir William Alexander, and they called it Nova Scotia, which was Latin for New Scotland.
There you go.
And it's kind of like a peninsula. It's connected at New Brunswick, but his original included New Brunswick and included eventually Anticosti and
right.
part of the Quebec coast.
Mm-hmm.
He even tried to claim the tip of Newfoundland. So he claimed, whether he took possession of it all or not is debatable, but he claimed a large chunk of land there. And how he got Anticosti and the Quebec shoreline there was through a second grant that was for the river and Gulf of Canada. So basically they hemmed Quebec in, because Quebec is down at the end of the St. Lawrence Gulf where it turns into the St. Lawrence River, and they were claiming everything surrounding that.
All right, let me get this straight. You got the French king claiming a bunch of land, the English king is claiming a bunch of land, and they're sort of the same chunks of land in part.
Yeah.
Well, that makes it easy.
And you have the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia there to defend the English interest or the British interest.
Right.
And you have the Knights of Malta there to defend the French interest.
Holy mackerel. That's
They're
confusing.
vying for it head to head. Head to head. So while the seeds of an international war were building in Europe between England and France, this obscure corner of the world, known as Nova Scotia, became the scene of an intense strife between these two knighthoods. And so those participating in this conflict, again, were the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, led by William Alexander's son, William, who appears to be the world's first Freemason. And he was vying against Isaac de Razilly, that we mentioned earlier, who was a Knight of Malta and the leader of the French in Nova Scotia. And this is absolutely proven in 1632 with the capture of Andrew Forster, who was third in charge of the Knights Baronet settlers. And Razilly captured him and his 41 men and sent him back to Great Britain. Just for a minute, I want to return to Samuel de Champlain. The first ship that he ever captained, according to his own writing, was for Don Francisco Columba, a Knight of Malta, of course, in an expedition to the Caribbean. The ship was named the St. Julian. See, on this next slide, you can see the drawing of Champlain standing there, and so his adventures in Nova Scotia were sponsored by Amar de Chase, commander of the Knights of Malta, and he was followed in that position by Charles Holt de Montmagny. I'm having as much trouble as you are with these names.
I think you did pretty well on that one.
Knight of Malta.
And this was in 1599, you said?
No, this was in they went over in 1604.
Okay.
And then the new leader who came was Charles de Razilly. Isaac de Razilly. So the fact that Razilly and Montmagny and Chase were all Knights of Malta,
wow,
and Champlain was sponsored by a Knight of Malta, again, this just hammers the point home that it was the Knights of Malta that were directing this whole French attempt to settle Nova Scotia. And Champlain actually wrote about...
Would you like to, could I share what he wrote?
Yeah.
Okay, this is what he says. Now, At this time, the armament of the King of Spain, which is wont to go every year to the West Indies, was fitting out, and there came from the said king a nobleman named Don Francisco Coloma, a Knight of Malta, to be general of the said armament, who, seeing our vessel fitted out and ready for service, and knowing it was a very good sailor, resolved to make use of it, and to take it at the ordinary rate, which is 1 crown per ton per month, so that I had occasion to rejoice seeing my hopes revive, the more so that Captain Provencal, my uncle, having been engaged elsewhere and unable to make the voyage, committed to me the charge and care of the said ship, which I accepted very willingly, and therefore we sought out General Coloma to know if it would suit him that I should make the voyage. This he freely granted me, with evidence of being well pleased thereat, promising me his favor and assistance, which he has not since denied me upon occasions. The said armament set sail in the beginning of the month of January of the year 1599.
And so this shows that Champlain was under the wing of the Knights of Malta from his very first role as a captain of a ship. And this association continued throughout his time in Nova Scotia and Quebec. Of course, it helped that he was related to Cardinal Richelieu and also to the Knights of Malta families of his past. Champlain's forefather, Guillaume Beauchard de Champagny, again, I apologize for the pronunciation,
We're doing the best we can.
was the grandfather of Richelieu's mother. His family had members amongst the Knights of Malta. And this Champagny was admitted to the Order of Malta in 1658. So Beauchard de Champagny was therefore a relative of the Cardinal,
Okay.
as well as a relative of Samuel de Champlain.
Holy
In fact,
mackerel.
Richelieu was related to de Razilli,
That's true, yeah.
and
They're
also
cousins.
related to Charles Holt Montmagny as
my
well.
gosh.
So it seems that these men had a dual loyalty. One was to France, but the other was to Malta. And by keeping it all in the family, they could serve both without creating any controversy.
Big web. Well, let me tell you some more. Aymar de Chast, or Chaste, died May 13th, 1603, shortly after this adventure to Acadia had begun, and Champlain became lieutenant governor of New France. Knights of Malta, Isaac de Razilli, had been charged with becoming lieutenant governor of New France, but instead supported Champlain in that role while he commanded Nova Scotia or Acadia. When Champlain died, he was replaced by another Knight of Malta, Charles Gualt de Montmagny. Champlain had built the first 2 forts at Quebec. Montmagny built the third in 1636.
And on that slide there, you'll see Montmagny off to the right.
Mm-hmm.
But this community here that you see, that's basically the 3 rivers in French. And that is a painting done in in 1700s. So this isn't long after this period we're talking about. And that shows you that's the St. Lawrence River,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a French community along there.
So the Knights of Malta are all over the place.
Yes.
Montmagny was admitted in the Order of Malta in the Grand Priory of France on August 3rd, 1622. That is the precise date when he arrived in Malta, having left Paris on July 1, 1622. His biographer numbers no less, ready, than 37 relatives who belonged to the Order of Malta. Both Razilli and Montmagny came from very embedded Knights of Malta families.
Yep.
Montmagny arrived in Quebec on June 11th, 1636, to take up his post, accompanied by a lieutenant who also belonged to the Order of Malta named Achilles de Isle. A Knight of Malta identified as the Chevalier de la Roche Jacqueline captained one of the ships called the Saint Jacques or Saint James, which brought Montmagny and his lieutenant to New France. Welcoming Montmagny was another knight of the order, Marc-Antoine, Rastafer de Châteaufort, who had been acting commandant of New France since Champlain's death on Christmas 1635. The Knights of Malta were now fully in charge in both Nova Scotia and Quebec. Yet another Knight of Malta, Noel Brulard de Sillery, gave his name to the former town of Sillery, today part of Quebec City. It's still there, right?
Yes.
Sillery. Admitted to the order in 1598, de Sillery became ambassador of the King of France to the Pope with the specific mission of obtaining, ready? A Catholic cardinal's red hat for none other than Richelieu. He was also the Malta Order's ambassador to the King of France. Several other notable knights of the Order of Malta served in New France and in Acadia, along with even after Razilli and Montmagny. Thus, it was appropriate to celebrate 100 years of the Canadian Navy with the presence of the Prince Grand Master of the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta in the Grand Harbor of the city of Halifax. Isaac de Razilli's Chegbuktu, okay, where he envisioned a priory of the order. That was a tough one. Okay, as shown on this slide, coming up, in 1647, Montmagny, Knight of the Order of Malta, and first true governor of New France, had a Knights of Malta cross carved in stone and set into the walls of Chateau Saint-Louis, the seat of power of the French. This is not the only stone, though, on which is carved the cross of Malta to be found in metropolitan Quebec City. Chateau Richer is a town located a short distance northeast of Quebec on the left bank of the St. Lawrence River. Displayed at the Centre d'Interpretation de la Côte de Beaupré.
Good job.
Thank you. Located there is the original cornerstone of the first convent built for the Sisters of the Congregation de Notre Dame. This stone also bears a Maltese cross symbol. Our thanks goes out to Jean-Louis Trudel, General Director of this museum, for the accompanying photographs taken just last week specifically for this show. Mr. Trudel also supplied us with a wealth of information that not only confirmed our research, but added to it, as did the Order of the Knights of Malta of Nova Scotia. Montmagny also built a hospital called the Hotel Dieu, or the House of God, named after its mother hospital in France. Both hospitals were run by the Hospitaller or Knights of Malta sister nuns, as you can see. The hospital at Quebec was officially founded in 1637 in order to meet the colony's need for health care by Marie Madeleine de Vignereau, the niece of Cardinal Richelieu. She entrusted the task to the nuns of the Hospitaller sisters, whose spiritual vocation was as nurses. This cemented the Knights of Malta's influence in this area in two new ways, through Montmagny and through the Hospitaller nurses.
Everywhere. From Quebec all through Nova Scotia down to La Havre. We know that they were even in Mahone Bay, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the influence of the Knights of Malta was now baked into the French attempts to settle New France, which included Quebec and Acadia. And this larger area was generally known as New France. Champlain founded Quebec in 1608. They'd been over at Port Royal starting in 1604 and 5, and then they worked up to Quebec. And he located it where the Gulf of the St. Lawrence narrows down to become the St. Lawrence River. This spot was attractive in many ways, but its fatal flaw was that it left little room to escape if a frontal attack was made from the Gulf, which is what happened. Because in 1629, there were three brothers by the last name of Kirk, and they attacked and took over Quebec. And the same year, they attacked and took over Port Royal for Sir William Alexander as he began to settle his Knights Baronet settlers there. And so on this slide that you can see at the left is a drawing that Champlain did again of Quebec. And you can see where the red arrow is on the map at the right, where Quebec is located. And if William Alexander actually was able to claim all of the Gulf of Canada, of St. Lawrence, the Kirk brothers, all they had to do was sail basically down the Gulf and up the river, and they had Quebec
There you go.
cornered, and that's exactly what happened. And so it was, even though it was a beautiful place, it had this distinct disadvantage that there was nowhere to go except to run into the woods. So all seemed well and good, except that, unfortunately for Alexander, as you mentioned earlier, Charles II of Charles I of Great Britain gave Nova Scotia back to France in a treaty signed March 29th, 1632, which is when my theory about Oak Island begins. And this is when the Scots were directed to leave their settlement at Port Royal, and several ships did, and they were allowed to take their gold and silver with them and their weapons and all of that. But Andrew Forster decided to stay behind with roughly 50 other Scots as like a guerrilla operation, and that's when Razilli had to go track him down and arrest him, and sent them back too. So you can see that we've laid it out where the Knights of Baronet were in absolute direct competition with the Knights of Malta for Nova Scotia, and a lot of this was taking place around Mahone Bay, particularly at La Have, but around Mahone Bay, and we're going to go a little deeper into that part of the story in our second half. And we urge you to come back and watch the second half after a little intermission, because we're going to show you, we've now shown you 2 Knights of Malta stones from Quebec, but we're going to show you 2 potential Knights of Malta stones in mainland Nova Scotia, and 1 possible Knights of Malta stone on Oak Island itself. So be sure to check out the second half of this great untold Nova Scotia tale. And it's available nowhere else in the world except right here on Oak Island Plus.
So folks, take a little breather. We're going to take a breather. We got a lot more of the story to tell you. So please click on part 2 of Oak Island Plus, episode 12. We'll be right back with you.
This is Robert Clotworthy, and you have been listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Be sure to catch every episode.